For decades, one skull sitting in a private collection was called proof that humanity had made contact with something not of this earth. Believers said its DNA would finally confirm an alien hybrid walked among us. Then the actual lab results came back, and what they revealed was not what anyone selling the mystery wanted you to hear. If you've spent any time down the rabbit hole of ancient mysteries and alien conspiracy theories, you've probably come across the Starchild Skull at some point. It's one of the most famous proof of aliens artifacts in modern pop culture, discussed on late-night radio, featured in documentaries, and endlessly shared across social media as the one piece of hard physical evidence that finally proves extraterrestrials interacted with humans in the past. The skull itself does look genuinely strange. It has a massively enlarged, bulbous cranium. Its eye sockets are shallow and oddly shaped. It's noticeably smaller and lighter than a typical human skull. Its size should be, and it lacks certain features you'd expect to find, like a normal brow ridge or standard frontal sinuses. For decades, this appearance alone was enough to convince a huge number of people that they were looking at something not entirely human. But here's the part almost nobody tells you when they show you a photo of this skull for shock value. Scientists have actually tested it multiple times using real forensic DNA labs, and the results are conclusive. Let's rewind and understand where this skull actually came from, because the origin story matters. According to the account given by the people who owned it, the skull was found in the 1930s inside a mine tunnel in Mexico, discovered alongside the remains of what appeared to be a normal adult human female, presumably a mother, buried beside it. The unusual skull eventually made its way through several private owners before landing with a man named Lloyd Pye, who became the public face of the Starchild Project, an organization dedicated to promoting the skull as potential evidence of extraterrestrial or hybrid origin. Pye spent years raising funds, commissioning DNA testing, and publicizing every preliminary result as a groundbreaking step toward proving non-human ancestry. And to be fair to the mystery itself, some of those early results genuinely were strange, at least on the surface, which is exactly why the story caught fire the way it did. Let's go through the actual timeline of testing, because it matters enormously which results were solid science and which were misleading, cherry-picked, or simply misunderstood by the people promoting them. The very first genetic test was carried out back in 1999 at the Bureau of Legal Dentistry in Vancouver, a legitimate forensic DNA laboratory. That test found standard X and Y chromosomes in samples taken from the skull. Standard X and Y chromosomes are about as ordinary and human as genetic material gets. That single result alone should have ended the alien hybrid theory before it even really began, since an alien-human hybrid would not be expected to carry a completely typical human sex chromosome pair. Then, in 2003, a more advanced round of testing was conducted by a lab called Trace Genetics in California. This test focused on mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively from the mother. The results were unambiguous. The child's mitochondrial DNA belonged to Haplogroup C, a lineage extremely common among Native American populations. This proved, beyond any reasonable scientific doubt, that the Starchild's biological mother was a fully human Native American woman. Interestingly, testing on the adult female skeleton found buried alongside the child revealed a different haplogroup entirely, haplogroup A, meaning that adult woman was not actually the Starchild's biological mother, just another Native American individual buried nearby, likely from the same community or era. At this point, promoters of the alien theory shifted their argument. They said, fine, the mother was human, but what about the father? What about the nuclear DNA, the genetic material inherited from both parents that would reveal the skull's full ancestry, not just the maternal line? This became the new frontier of the mystery, and it's where things get genuinely messy. Because this is exactly where a lot of the sensational claims started outrunning the actual science. In 2010, further nuclear DNA testing was conducted, this time submitted to the National Institutes of Health BLAST database, a tool used to compare genetic sequences against known reference data from humans and other species. 265 base pairs were successfully matched, and researchers confirmed that this portion of the DNA was, in fact, human. But rather than settling the debate, promotional material from the Starchild Project began circulating claims that some nuclear DNA fragments couldn't be matched to anything in the database, framing this gap as potential evidence of an unknown or non-human genetic contribution. This is where independent scientists and skeptics started pushing back hard, and for good reason. Here's the problem with that framing, and it's a problem that shows up constantly in pseudoscientific claims built around real lab data. Unmatched DNA sequences are extremely common in ancient or degraded samples, and they almost always come down to mundane, boring explanations. Contamination from soil bacteria, fungal DNA, handling contamination from the dozens of people who touched the skull over decades, or simply incomplete reference databases that don't yet contain every possible human genetic variant, especially from underrepresented or ancient populations. Forensic geneticists have been extremely clear on this point. An unmatched sequence is not evidence of alien ancestry. It's an artifact of working with old, poorly preserved biological material that has been contaminated repeatedly across nearly a century of handling, storage, polishing, and even varnishing, all of which actively destroy the integrity of a DNA sample. And this is exactly what happened when independent forensic analysis dug deeper into the nuclear DNA results. Subsequent testing confirmed that both an X and a Y chromosome were present in the sample, and both were entirely human. David Sweet, the director of the Bureau of Legal Dentistry who oversaw some of this analysis, stated plainly that this finding was conclusive evidence the child was not only human, but that both of the child's parents must have been human as well, since each parent contributes exactly one human sex chromosome during conception. There is no version of that genetic math that leaves room for a non-human father. If the father had been anything other than a typical human male, the chromosomal pairing simply would not work the way standard human reproduction requires. So where did all the non-human DNA excitement actually come from? A closer look reveals a pattern that skeptics in the scientific community have pointed out repeatedly. Preliminary, unverified test results were publicized enthusiastically by the Starchild project before they had been independently confirmed or peer-reviewed. One widely cited claim involved a fragment of a gene called FOXP2, a gene that is remarkably conserved across humans and closely related primates and plays an important role in speech and cognitive development. Promotional material claimed this particular DNA fragment showed dozens of differences compared to the standard human version, framing this as evidence of a fundamentally different, possibly non-human origin. But this claim was never independently reproduced by outside labs, was never published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and came from an undisclosed laboratory whose identity was never revealed, for reasons described only as security concerns. In real forensic science, results that cannot be independently verified, reproduced, or peer-reviewed simply don't count as established fact. They're preliminary claims at best and marketing material at worst. Meanwhile, mainstream medical experts who examined the skull's actual physical structure had a far less mysterious explanation ready from the very beginning, one that fits every unusual feature of the skull without requiring anything beyond standard human biology. Neurologist Stephen Novella, affiliated with Yale University's medical school, examined the skull's characteristics and concluded that it displays essentially every hallmark of a child who died as a result of congenital hydrocephalus. This is a real, well-documented medical condition where cerebrospinal fluid builds up abnormally inside the skull, causing the cranium to expand outward, sometimes dramatically, while other bones and facial features develop abnormally alongside the pressure. This single diagnosis accounts for the enlarged bulbous cranium, the unusual shallow eye sockets, and other irregular skeletal features, without requiring any explanation beyond a tragic but entirely human medical condition affecting a young child roughly 900 years ago. It's also worth mentioning that some of the skull's unusual appearance likely comes from something with an even simpler explanation: deliberate cultural head shaping. Numerous ancient cultures across the Americas practiced intentional skull binding on infants, using boards or wrappings pressed against a baby's soft, not yet fully fused skull bones to produce an elongated or otherwise modified head shape as a cultural or status marker. Combined with a genuine medical condition like hydrocephalus, this kind of intentional shaping could easily account for additional irregularities in the skull's overall form, layering a real cultural practice on top of a real medical tragedy. So when you put the entire picture together, using actual, reproducible, peer-reviewed forensic evidence rather than promotional claims from undisclosed labs, the Starchild skull tells a very different story than the one that made it internet famous. It is 100% human. Its mother was a Native American woman carrying Haplogroup C mitochondrial DNA. Its nuclear DNA contains standard human X and Y chromosomes, meaning its father was human as well. Its unusual shape is most likely explained by congenital hydrocephalus, quite possibly compounded by intentional cultural head shaping, practiced by the community it came from roughly 900 years ago. Every claim suggesting otherwise traces back to preliminary, unverified, non-peer-reviewed results promoted enthusiastically by people with a direct financial and ideological interest in keeping the mystery alive. And honestly, once you strip away the alien hype, what's actually left here is a much sadder, much more human story. This wasn't an alien hybrid making contact with our species. This was a small child, likely suffering from a severe and ultimately fatal medical condition, born into a Native American community roughly 9 centuries ago, whose remains were buried with care near an adult woman from the same population. Somewhere along the way, nearly 1,000 years later, that child's skull was pulled out of the ground, passed between collectors, polished, varnished, sold, and eventually turned into a global symbol for a theory that had nothing to do with who that child actually was, The real story isn't about aliens visiting Earth. It's about a genuine medical tragedy that modern forensic science has now clearly and repeatedly explained, and about how easily a compelling human story about disease and death can get rewritten into science fiction when the people telling it want something more exciting than the truth. It's worth spending a little more time on how this skull actually traveled through the hands of collectors before it ever reached a real laboratory, because that chain of custody explains a lot about why the DNA evidence became so messy and easy to misrepresent. After its reported discovery in that Mexican mine tunnel in the 1930s, the skull passed between several private owners over the following decades, long before modern forensic techniques even existed to properly analyze ancient or degraded genetic material. Along the way, it was reportedly cleaned, polished, and even coated in varnish or lacquer at different points, treatments that might have made the object more presentable for private collectors, but that absolutely devastate the integrity of any biological material still clinging to the bone. Modern ancient DNA labs go to extraordinary lengths to avoid contamination, working in sterile, positive pressure clean rooms, wearing full protective suits, and treating every surface with bleach and UV light specifically to destroy any stray modern DNA that could contaminate an ancient sample. A skull that spent decades being handled barehanded by private collectors, polished with unknown chemical treatments, and stored in ordinary household conditions is about as far from that ideal as you can get. Every additional person who touched it, every cleaning product used on it, every environment it sat in introduced new possibilities for contamination. And contamination is precisely the kind of thing that produces confusing, inconsistent, or unmatched genetic results, the exact kind of results that got repackaged as evidence of alien ancestry. This is actually a well-known and heavily studied problem in the broader field of ancient DNA research, sometimes just called ADNA. Scientists working with genuinely ancient samples, whether from Egyptian mummies, Ice Age remains, or medieval burial sites, routinely encounter exactly this kind of issue. Old, degraded DNA tends to fragment into extremely short pieces over time. Those short fragments become easy targets for contamination from bacteria, fungi, and modern human DNA left behind by anyone who has ever touched the sample without proper protective equipment. When a fragment doesn't match anything in a reference database, the responsible scientific conclusion is almost always that the fragment is either contaminated, too short, and degraded to identify with confidence, or represents a genuine but simply undercatalogued human genetic variation. Since reference databases even now remain incomplete for many ancient and underrepresented population groups, jumping from an unmatched fragment straight to the conclusion of extraterrestrial ancestry isn't just a scientific stretch. It disregards the single most common, well-documented explanation available in favor of the single, least likely one. Let's also spend a bit more time on congenital hydrocephalus itself, because understanding the condition really drives home just how well it explains everything unusual about this skull. Hydrocephalus occurs when cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that normally cushions and protects the brain and spinal cord, builds up abnormally inside the skull instead of draining and being reabsorbed the way it should. In infants and young children, whose skull bones haven't yet fully fused together, this abnormal pressure can cause the entire cranium to expand outward dramatically as the brain and surrounding tissue are pushed against the skull's still flexible plates. Depending on the severity and the exact location of fluid buildup, this can produce exactly the kind of enlarged, rounded, bulbous cranial shape seen in the Starchild skull. It can also affect the development of the eye sockets, sometimes making them appear shallower or differently angled than in a typical skull, and it can interfere with the normal development of the frontal sinuses and brow ridge, both of which are notably reduced or absent on the Starchild skull. In short, nearly every single physical feature that made this skull look so otherworldly to casual observers lines up directly with the known effects of a real, well-documented, and unfortunately often fatal childhood medical condition. Untreated congenital hydrocephalus, especially 900 years ago, long before any form of modern medical intervention existed, was frequently fatal in early childhood, which lines up precisely with dental analysis, suggesting the child died around 5 years of age. There was no surgical option, no shunt to relieve the pressure, nothing beyond whatever traditional care the community could offer a child suffering from a condition nobody at the time could have understood in modern medical terms. That's part of what makes the real explanation so much more emotionally weighty than the alien theory ever was. This wasn't a hybrid being born from some extraordinary cosmic event. This was an ordinary human tragedy, a child suffering from a devastating and untreatable illness, cared for by a community that buried that child with apparent dignity and respect nonetheless. It's also worth acknowledging why the alien explanation caught on so powerfully in the first place, because understanding that helps explain why this myth has had such staying power for decades. Human brains are wired to notice unusual patterns, and to find pattern-based explanations more satisfying than random chance or misfortune. A rare genetic and developmental condition, producing an unusually shaped skull is, statistically, an incredibly uncommon event, which makes it feel special, almost designed rather than simply an unlucky roll of biological dice. Combine that psychological tendency with a charismatic promoter, decades of media coverage, documentaries, and radio appearances treating the mystery as unresolved, and you get a story that spreads far faster and sticks far longer than the comparatively mundane, if deeply sad, medical explanation ever could. This is a pattern that shows up again and again across pseudoscientific claims. The exciting, mysterious version of events travels across the internet at lightning speed, while the careful, peer-reviewed, scientifically verified explanation quietly sits in a forensic lab report that almost nobody ever actually reads. Skeptical researchers and forensic scientists have been remarkably consistent on this point for years now, repeatedly pointing back to the same body of verified evidence every time a new wave of alien hybrid claims resurfaces online. The mitochondrial DNA evidence establishing a human, Native American mother has never been seriously disputed by any credentialed geneticist. The nuclear DNA evidence showing standard human X and Y chromosomes has likewise held up under every round of independent scrutiny it has faced. What has never held up, under any serious peer review or independent replication, are the specific sensational claims about unmatched gene fragments or mysterious non-human sequences, all of which trace back to preliminary, unpublished, non-peer-reviewed testing conducted by labs whose identities were, in some cases, deliberately kept hidden from public scrutiny. In responsible science, a claim that cannot be independently checked, reproduced, or reviewed by other qualified experts simply doesn't rise to the level of established fact, no matter how many times it gets repeated in a documentary or shared across social media. If topics like this scratch that same itch for you, uncovering the real science hiding behind viral conspiracy theories, do me a favor and hit the like button before you go. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one. And if you want to see more myths get put under the microscope like this, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. It's also useful to place the Starchild Skull within a broader pattern because it is far from the only case where a genuine, tragic medical condition got rebranded into an alien mystery. Throughout history, skeletal remains showing rare congenital conditions, unusual bone growths, or developmental disorders have repeatedly been mistaken for or deliberately marketed as evidence of something otherworldly, long before modern medicine had the tools to properly explain them. Cases involving severe craniofacial abnormalities, rare bone diseases, and other congenital skeletal disorders have shown up throughout the history of anomaly hunting, each one eventually explained by mainstream medicine once proper testing became available, and each one having spent years, sometimes decades, circulating a supposed proof of something beyond human biology in the meantime. The Starchild Skull simply became one of the most famous and most heavily promoted examples of this pattern, helped along by a dedicated organization built specifically to keep the mystery alive commercially, selling replicas, book deals, and documentary appearances built on top of an explanation that real forensic science had already quietly settled years earlier. And there's one more detail worth sitting with before we close this out, because it says something about how conspiracy narratives sustain themselves long after the science is settled. Every time independent researchers publish results confirming human origin, the Starchild Project and its supporters have historically responded not by revising the theory, but by shifting the goalposts to some new, still unexplained detail, whether that's a specific gene fragment, a claimed anomaly in bone density, or some other technical footnote pulled out of context. This is a recognizable pattern across pseudoscience more broadly. Rather than treating disconfirming evidence as a reason to update a belief, the belief gets protected by continuously redefining what would actually count as proof, always keeping the goal just one more test away. Real science works the opposite way. It follows the evidence wherever it leads, updates conclusions when new data arrives, and treats reproducibility and peer review as the baseline requirement for any claim to be taken seriously, not an inconvenient formality to be worked around. At the end of the day, the Starchild Skull isn't proof that we're not alone in the universe. It's proof of something almost the opposite, a reminder of how fragile human life could be centuries before modern medicine existed, and how a genuine medical condition, filtered through decades of selective storytelling and unverified lab claims, can transform a tragic human death into a legend that outlives the truth by nearly 100 years. The DNA didn't lie. It just took actual peer-reviewed science, patience, and a willingness to look past the hype to finally hear what it was really saying all along.